As we start into the next lesson, we start to look at sets of numbers in a little bit of a different way, and we start to introduce the idea of a function and what a function is in math. Now, it's very important that you learn the definition of a function because Algebra 2 is just basically your introduction to the most basic functions in math. And then as you progress further into different mathematics, higher level mathematics, you just extend that knowledge of functions and the different types of functions that you know how to deal with. So we give you a good little running start in the first handful of lessons. So we start, however, before getting to a function, just by defining what a relation is. And a relation is just really simply a pairing of values. So we have one value paired up with a second value, and we call these values the inputs and the output values. Now, in this particular lesson, terminology becomes extremely important, so you must know the language, because the language is going to guide you to the answer, and most of the time the terminology is simply stated in the directions and asked in the question. So be sure to pay real close attention. Even though there's not a lot of problem solving going on here, there's lots of very important information. So as we look, whenever you have a relation, you can represent a relation in a number of different ways. One of the ways is through a mapping of diagrams. We can have tables, graphs, equations, and verbal descriptions. And the input values are what represent what's called the domain of the relation, and the output values represent the range. And so we're going to kind of start keeping up with a little bit of a table, if you will, as we go through this. So I'm going to go to another Microsoft document. I'm just going to kind of point out a few things. So let's just start real simply with an input and an output. And so we can simply start right there. Now, an input and an output can also be represented or labeled as the domain and the range. And so I'm just going to kind of start a little table right there, and by the end of this lesson we should have that filled out a little bit more. So let's go back to where we were. Now, if we want to take a relation and make it a function, what has to happen is the relation of the function, the relation is a function provided it has exactly one output for each input. So it's not a function if at least one input has more than one output. So basically, if you see the input twice, then it cannot be a function. And so we're going to find, or we're going to learn many different ways to identify that situation. So we'll just start with the basic ways of looking at relations and determine whether they're functions or not. And the simplest way is visual, and we're going to do that with what we call a mapping diagram. So let's take a look at example number 1 real quick. It says to identify the domain and the range for each mapping diagram. Tell whether the relation is a function or not. So what we have here is we have the input and the output, and if you recall, the input represents the domain, the output represents the range. And so we have all of the values that represent the domain will be consisted with -3, 1, and 4, and you can see how we write this as a set of numbers. As we move over to the range, we have 4 numbers instead of 3, and so the set of numbers is a little bit larger. Now, the second part of this question says to determine whether it is a function. And so if we look very closely, the 1 value in the input value is being repeated. It is used twice to match up with output values. And so if we look at the definition above, it can only have exactly 1 output for each input, or it cannot have any repeating input values, if you will. So if we look at this, it's very simple from the mapping diagram visual to tell whether it's a relationship, if the relation is a function or not. And in the case of part A, it is not. Now, if we move down to part B, again, identifying the domain, very straightforward. It's all the input values. The range is all of the output values. Now in this case, our input values each have 1 output value. as you can see, the output number 1 is used with 2 different inputs. This is okay. This is still a function because none of the input values are repeated, are used twice. And so it really doesn't matter if they go to the same output value or not. And so you can see visually the difference between a function and one that is not a function. And so this is very important for you to grasp right off the bat. So we look at sample problem number 1 here. And sample problem number 1 asks us simply to identify the domain and identify the range and tell whether it's a function or not. And so go ahead and pause the video and see if you can use the previous examples to help you with this. Okay, so let's just simply take a look. We'll start with the domain, and I'll just say the domain represents the set of values that are all the input values. So -1, 1, and 2. The range is going to be represented by all of the output values. And of course, I should write these in numerical order, which is appropriate for writing a set of values. Now, if we look at it to determine whether the relation is a function or not, we can see very simply that our -1 input value is actually being used twice, so there's a repeat. So this relationship is not a function. Okay, and it's as simple as that. So we'll go ahead and stop right there as just a quick introduction to domain and range, relations and functions.